Betrayed, an immersive audio drama by Square Angles. Mara Ellison was 36 when she arrived at Hawthorne Grange, a vast and weathered country house crouched against the moors of northern England. In 1885, the wind brought a constant cold that seemed to penetrate both the bones and the mind. She had come at the invitation of an old acquaintance, Evelyn Johnson, now Harrowsby. They had grown up in the same small town, occasionally sharing childhood secrets and aspirations, but had never been best friends. In their late teens, Mara learned that Evelyn had married Charles Harrowsby, a man of considerable wealth and a prominent landowner. Evelyn's marriage carried her far away into a realm Mara had only imagined from afar. The women maintained their friendship through letters and the occasional hurried message. While Evelyn stepped into a life of comfort and social standing, Mara remained behind, devoted to her work as a schoolteacher, unmarried and quietly content with her simple routines. Yet it had been nearly 2 years since Mara had last heard from Evelyn at all, which made the sudden invitation both surprising and disturbing. More astonishing still was the fact that this was the first time Evelyn had ever asked her to visit. The invitation made her feel oddly privileged, as though it granted her entry into a life not meant for her. But at the same time, a thread of concern wound tightly throughout her mind. 2 years of silence could not be easily dismissed, and she wondered what had changed, what had prompted Evelyn, after all this time, to contact her. A month later, Evelyn received Mara with practiced grace and warmth, her smiles gracious and her words carefully chosen. Nothing in her manner could be called unkind, yet Mara sensed a distance she could not bridge, a subtle aloofness, as though Evelyn were standing just out of range, observing rather than engaging. It was a marked contrast to the girl Mara had once known, who had laughed freely and spoken without restraint. This new Evelyn moved with composure and restraint, her affection measured, her attention divided. Mara's room was prepared for her on the lower floor, tucked away near the kitchen. It was smaller than she had imagined, certainly humbler than the grand guest chambers she had glimpsed along the upper corridors. But it was clean and comfortable, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a single window that looked out onto the darkened grounds. The proximity to the kitchen brought faint, lingering scents of herbs and smoke, offering a strange sort of comfort amid the unfamiliar surroundings. That evening, dinner was a restrained affair. Mara was briefly introduced to Evelyn's husband, Charles Harrowsby, a tall man with a grave expression and an air of distraction. He sat with them only a short while, spoke little, and ate even less. After a few polite remarks and several hurried bites, he excused himself and departed for his study at the far end of the house, leaving the women alone beneath the heavy chandelier and the long, echoing silence his absence seemed to leave behind. Once he had gone, Evelyn's reserve softened, and the two women spent the remainder of the evening speaking of safer things, of their childhood, of mutual acquaintances long scattered, of small-town stories that felt oddly distant now. Laughter came more easily then, though it never fully dispelled Mara's lingering sense that something remained unsaid. Eventually, fatigue claimed them both, and they retired for the night. Sleep did not come easily to Mara. Long after the house had settled into stillness, she lay awake, then rose to sit by the window, gazing out into the darkness. Moonlight barely touched the grounds below, leaving the world outside reduced to vague shapes and shadows. It was then she noticed movement, a carriage being quietly prepared, servants climbing aboard with hushed efficiency. Moments later, the carriage rolled away, its wheels muffled against the drive. The sight struck her as unusual, but in her tired state, she dismissed it as nothing more than late-night errands. At some point, exhaustion overtook her, and she slept. She was awakened abruptly by the sound of her name being called, soft, urgent, unmistakable. Her eyes flew open, heart pounding as she scanned the room through the darkness. There was nothing there, only shadows pressed close by the night. Then came a loud thump from just outside her door. Mara sat frozen for a moment, listening, her breath shallow. Gathering her courage, she slipped from the bed and crept toward the door. She opened it a fraction, the hinges barely whispering in protest. Beyond the threshold lay only darkness, thick and impenetrable. She leaned forward, peering into the corridor, but saw nothing, no movement, no light, no sign of whoever or whatever had disturbed her. A quiet sigh escaped her. Telling herself it had been nothing more than a dream carried too far into waking, she closed the door and returned to bed, though sleep, when it finally came again, was thin and uneasy. The next morning, Mara awoke far later than she intended, the pale light of day already spilling across the floor. With a quiet groan, she rose, dressed in haste, and made her way toward the kitchen, craving a warm cup of something, tea, broth, anything, to steady herself for the day ahead. She stopped short in the doorway. The kitchen was eerily still. The familiar clatter of pans, the low murmur of servants, and the comforting crackle of the stove were all absent. The hearth lay cold and dark, its ashes undisturbed. No fragrant steam curled through the air, no bread baked, and no kettle sang. It felt as though the room itself had been abandoned. Mara frowned and let out a slow breath. Unease crept in, prickling at the edges of her thoughts. Gathering her skirts, she turned and climbed the stairs, each step echoing more loudly than usual in the quiet house. At the top of the stairs, she nearly collided with Evelyn. Evelyn stood there wringing her hands, her face pale and drawn, worry etched deeply into her features. Her eyes flicked toward Mara, then past her, as though she were listening for something that never came. "Good morning, my dear," Mara said gently. "You seem troubled. What has happened?" For a moment, Evelyn did not answer. She sighed, her gaze distant, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled. She explained that her mother, who lived in a nearby town, had fallen suddenly and gravely ill. A message had arrived at dawn, and Evelyn knew she must go to her at once. She assured Mara she would return within the week, perhaps even sooner, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. She went on to explain that her husband had already left early that morning for urgent business and would not be back for a couple of days. The house, she said, could not be left empty. Her words tightened with urgency, as she insisted Mara remain behind to watch over it until either she or Charles returned. Mara was a little apprehensive about being there without Evelyn, but was okay with the servants being there. "The servants we keep only come in every so often, when needed," Evelyn added quietly, her eyes dropping. "You will be quite all right, though. There is plenty of food prepared for you, and the house is secure. I'll make sure of it." Mara hesitated. The thought of staying alone in the large, silent house unsettled her. "Huh. I will be here?" Alone? She asked. Yes, my dear friend. I really need your help. I am sure I will be back within the week, and Charles will be back in a few days. I am sure my mother is not that ill. I will make sure she is comfortable and will be right back, Evelyn told her. Mara sighed heavily and thought for a moment. She was ready to go to her home, but her friend needed her help, and loyalty, and affection won out over her unease. She nodded at last and agreed to stay. Evelyn thanked her with visible relief, and the next day, she left. The house fell silent once more, and this time, the stillness lingered. At first, solitude felt almost like a blessing. The house settled into a gentler rhythm without voices disturbing it, the long hours broken only by the ticking of clocks and the low, tired groan of beams adjusting to the cold. Mara welcomed the stillness, convincing herself that the quiet was restorative, that she simply needed time to adjust to being alone in such a vast place. That night, Mara heard footsteps in the corridor outside her room, slow and deliberate. They halted just beyond her door, as though whoever stood there knew precisely where she lay. Heart hammering, Mara wrenched the door open, the candlelight spilling into the passage. The corridor stretched away, empty and dust-choked, its shadows unmoving. There was no echo of retreating steps and no sign that anyone had ever been there. Then the disturbances multiplied. Doors she had locked with care were slightly open by morning, their latches cold and loose beneath her fingers. One dawn, she found muddy boot prints smeared near the back entrance, dark and wet against the stone. The ground of the garden was rock hard because it had not rained in a few days, and the dirt was incapable of holding such impressions. She stared at them until her eyes burned, unable to decide whether she feared an intruder or something worse. A few days later, in the middle of that uneasy week, Mara found herself roaming the house with no clear purpose, as if the rooms were quietly pulling her along. At the end of the west corridor, she stopped short. A door was open that had been firmly shut every day since her arrival. She was sure of that. She had tried the handle once out of idle curiosity and found it locked, or so she thought. Now it yawned wide, revealing a narrow stairwell that plunged downward into thick, lightless darkness. Cold air drifted up from below, carrying a faint damp smell like stone that had never known the sun. Mara gripped the doorframe and leaned forward, straining her eyes. The darkness seemed to press back at her, swallowing the faint light from the corridor. Her heart began to pound. Whatever lay down there, she did not want to meet it, not alone, and not now. She stepped back quickly, shut the door with a sharp thud, and dragged the nearest heavy piece of furniture across it. The legs scraped loudly against the floor, the noise reverberating too far down the hall. Only when the door was entirely blocked did she retreat, nearly running back to her room. She locked herself in and sat on the bed for a long time, listening to the house breathe. Eventually, she forced herself to act normally when hunger drove her to the kitchen, where she began preparing a simple meal left by the cook. The clink of utensils was unnaturally loud in the quiet space. The week was almost over, and the cook's food was running low. As she stirred, a flash of activity caught her eye. A shadow slid past the kitchen doorway, smooth and calculated. Mara paused abruptly, the spoon suspended in her hand. "Hello?" she called, her voice faint. "Who is there?" Silence answered her. Then, unmistakably, came the sound of footsteps, slow, measured, climbing the stairs. Each step groaned under invisible weight. Mara gulped nervously and set the spoon down, then picked it up again, gripping it as if it could serve as a weapon. She proceeded warily toward the staircase, every sense sharpened. The steps groaned beneath her feet as she climbed. When she reached the landing, she stopped. It was empty. The hallway stretched before her, unchanged, and every door was closed, just as she had left them. No shadows lingered, and no sound followed. A sudden chill spread through her, deeper than fear, settling through her very core. Mara didn't wait. She turned and hurried back down to the kitchen, her breath coming fast. Once inside, she stood leaning on the counter and let out a long, shaky sigh, telling herself it was exhaustion, imagination, anything but the truth pressing at her mind. She returned to her meal, though she could not dismiss the feeling that the house was watching her, waiting for something she had not yet done. By the 5th day, exhaustion had settled into Mara's bones like a dense mist. The house no longer seemed merely unfamiliar. It felt hostile, as though it resented her presence. She wanted nothing more than to pack her bag, lock the door behind her, and go home to a place that didn't whisper and groan in the night. But she couldn't. She had given her word to Evelyn. She had promised she would stay until Evelyn or her husband returned, and Mara had always taken her promises seriously. Still, the silence was troubling. 5 days, and not a single message from anyone. There had been no note or human connection at all. It seemed like the couple had disappeared, leaving her alone with a house that appeared distant and unnaturally lively for something built of wood and stone. Each day stretched longer than the last, and with every passing hour, Mara perceived with certainty that she had overstayed her welcome, if she had ever been welcomed at all. Sleep grew impossible. She stayed up late into the night, sitting rigid in her room or pacing the halls, listening. The smallest sounds, pipes knocking, floorboards settling, the wind brushing against the windows, sent her pulse surging. She kept candles lit even when her eyes burned from fatigue, afraid of what might move unseen in the dark. She never shook the feeling that she was being watched, and it pressed against her back when she stood at the sink and crept up her spine when she walked down the hall. Sometimes she would turn suddenly, convinced she would catch someone standing just behind her. Every time, there was nothing. Only space and closed doors that appeared to hide secrets rather than protect her. More than once, she thought she heard movement outside, a soft scrape near the back door, and the slight crunch of steps on gravel that shouldn't have shifted at all. She checked the locks repeatedly, her hands shaking while she tested each one. The house was secure, yet the anxiety persisted because she was sure someone else was there, or worse, trying to get in. Mara's nerves were worn thin, her thoughts looping endlessly between promise and dread. She told herself she was imagining things, that exhaustion was playing games on her mind. Yet deep inside, she knew something was wrong. Eventually, sleep abandoned her entirely. She dragged heavy furniture across doorways, scraping chairs and tables into place until her arms trembled with exhaustion. The barricades were inept, inelegant things, but they gave her a fragile sense of control. By the end of the week, her nerves had eroded. Mara had expected Evelyn or her husband to return by now, to laugh away her fears and restore order to the house. Instead, the days dragged on without relief. Restless and desperate for fresh air, Mara bravely paced the garden paths, her breath swirling in the cold as she debated whether to flee the place entirely. A week alone was enough. She longed for home, for familiarity, for walls that did not seem to watch her in return. The sound of an approaching carriage broke her thoughts. Relief rushed over her as the mail carrier reined in his horse and handed her a single letter, sealed in Evelyn's careful hand. She read it slowly. My dear Mara, it is with much regret that I must inform you that my mother has taken a turn for the worse, and I will remain with her indefinitely. My husband, Charles, should be home now and will help you return safely. Thank you for all your help, my dear. I will write again when I know more. Evelyn. The words left Mara hollow. Shame worked its way in as it dawned on her how completely she had focused on her fear, scarcely considering Evelyn's anguish. Yet one question refused to be silent. Where was Charles Harrowsby? He had not returned, not once, not even briefly. The house remained as empty as before. Forcing herself to stay calm, Mara decided to wait a few more days. Surely he would arrive. Surely this was only another delay. The middle of the second week passed without him. Mara's nerves unraveled bit by bit. Food became an afterthought. Some days, she could not remember when she had last eaten. She wrote letter after letter to Evelyn, sealing them with shaking hands, but never mailed them. The house itself had quieted down. The peculiar occurrences had disappeared, and all appeared usual. Yet Mara was still alone, no Charles and no Evelyn. When Evelyn finally returned, nearly a month later, she found the front door immovable, wedged shut from the inside. She pressed her gloved hands against the wood and frowned. Hello? Charles, my dear? She called, rapping lightly at first, then louder. Are you here? Why is the door blocked? Her voice echoed quietly through the house. Inside, Mara startled awake from the stiff-backed chair in the front room where she had been dozing. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Then she remembered, and fear overwhelmed her. She leapt to her feet and rushed to the door, her heart beating wildly. With frantic strength, she dragged the chair and the small table aside, scraping them loudly across the floor, and tugged the door open. Evelyn barely had time to react before Mara threw her arms around her. I'm so happy to see you. Anyone! Mara cried, clinging to her as if frightened she might vanish. May I go home now? Please, may I go home? Evelyn stiffened in surprise, then gently pulled back to look at her. Mara, why are you still here? She said sharply. Where is Charles, and what in the world has happened? She entered the room, her eyes opening wide as she took in the scene. Why is my house... She didn't finish the sentence. Furniture stood at odd angles, and doors were wedged shut. The atmosphere seemed heavy and stale, as though the house itself had been hushed. Evelyn moved quickly from room to room, peering behind chairs, the expression on her face growing more severe by the second. Then she hurried up the stairs, calling down sharply, Mara! Mara followed, wringing her hands. What happened here? Evelyn demanded once they were back in the front room. Why is my house in this state? Why are all the doors barricaded? Her stare was directed at Mara. What have you done? Mara gulped nervously, tears filling her eyes. I don't know where your husband is, she spoke quietly. He never came back. I stayed because you asked me to wait for you. Evelyn's expression didn't soften. Then why is the house like this? She asked again. Mara lowered her eyes. I'm sorry, Evelyn. Strange things were happening here. There were strange noises and shadows. Doors were opening on their own. Her voice faltered slightly. I was frightened. I only did what I had to do to protect myself. She looked up, pleading. Please, may I go home now? Evelyn studied her for several moments, then exhaled sharply. Help me put everything back where it belongs, she said at last. When we're finished, I'll arrange a carriage to take you into town. A wave of relief washed over Mara. Without another word, she began moving furniture, straightening chairs, and unbarricading doors. She worked quickly, driven by a single thought: leaving. Evelyn followed her from room to room, directing her briskly, as though restoring order might erase whatever had taken place. At last, only one door remained. The heavy one at the back of the house, still blocked by a chest and a table. It led to the stairs that descended into darkness. Together they shoved the furniture aside. Evelyn grasped the handle and pulled the door open. A cold, humid air rose from below. She leaned forward, peering into the blackness. Go and pack your things, Mara, Evelyn said without looking back. It's too late to travel tonight. I'll have a carriage ready for you tomorrow. She paused. Oh, and fetch me a candle. I want to go down into the basement. For the first time in weeks, Mara experienced something close to joy. She was finally going home. She quickly went to the kitchen and returned with a lit candle, handing it to Evelyn with unsteady fingers. Then she turned and went to her small bedroom to pack, her movements quick and light, while behind her, Evelyn stepped onto the narrow stairs and began her descent into the dark below. Evelyn held the candle before her as she went down, the flame shuddering at every footfall. The stairs moaned beneath her weight, a slow, complaining sound that echoed up the narrow shaft. The air grew colder the farther she went and was damp enough to prickle her skin. It was imbued with the aroma of clay and something older, stale and metallic, which felt wrong. At the bottom, she paused. The cellar stretched farther than she recalled, the candlelight barely touching its boundaries. Shadows clung to the walls, thick and layered, as though they had been disturbed and never fully settled back into place. The stone floor was scuffed with marks that hadn't been there before, dragging lines, half-moon scrapes, and footprints that stopped abruptly as if whoever made them had disappeared. "Charles," she called, her murmur lower now, cautious. The sound seemed to sink into the darkness without reply. She took another step forward, then another, raising the candle higher. Shelves ran along one wall, jars and bottles arranged in uneasy disorder. Some had been knocked over, their contents dried into dark stains on the stone. At the far end of the cellar stood the old work table. It had been moved. Slowly, she approached it, the candlelight revealing gouges in the floor beneath its legs, as though it had been shoved back and forth repeatedly. On the tabletop lay a scatter of objects, chalk markings smeared by a careless hand, lengths of twine, and a knife she did not recognize. Her lips pursed into a thin line. Evelyn smirked. Perfect, she thought. He did a good job staging this. This is how she wanted to leave this room. So, she uttered softly, let's see how you will explain you did not come down here. A faint noise reached her then, a soft, rhythmic drip. She turned toward it, following the noise to the far corner where the stone wall looked darker and wetter. Kneeling, she lifted the candle closer. The drip was not water. It was seeping from behind a hastily patched section of wall, the work uneven and rushed. A hairline crack ran through it, and from that crack oozed something dense and viscous. Evelyn straightened slowly. "Mara," she whispered, though the girl was far above her now, busy dreaming of home. "You poor, foolish woman." She touched the wall, pressing gently. The stone shifted. Behind her, the candle flame flared suddenly, bending as though a breath had passed through the room. Evelyn did not turn. "I know," she said calmly. "I kept you waiting." The cellar was chillier now. With deliberate care, Evelyn set the candle down on the floor, rolled up her sleeves, and placed both hands against the wall. Whatever lay sealed behind it stirred faintly, as if in response to her presence. "Charles, my dear, I see you are still with us. Barely. Don't worry," she whispered gently. "Everything will be put back in order now." Upstairs, Mara folded her last dress and smiled to herself, unaware that the house had finally exhaled and that the real reason she was being kept here had just been uncovered. Suddenly, a scream pierced the silence from somewhere below Mara's room, sharp, raw, and filled with terror. The sound froze her for half a breath before instinct took over. The dress fell from her fingers and pooled on the floor as she bolted for the door, her heart beating wildly. She reached the basement entrance and flung the door open. Frigid air swept up the narrow stairwell. From the top step, Mara peered down into the darkness below, shadows from the candle clinging to the walls like living creatures. Her feet refused to move. "Evelyn!" Mara called, her voice trembling with fear. "Evelyn, are you okay?" A strained voice resounded from the darkness. "Mara, come quickly!" Evelyn cried. "Something has happened to Charles." Terror seized its grip around Mara's chest. Swallowing hard, she mustered her bravery and began her descent, one measured step at a time. The wooden stairs protested beneath her weight, each sound magnified in the unbearable silence. She scanned the basement anxiously, half bracing for something, or someone, to move within the dimness. At the bottom of the stairs, the odor hit her first, moist stone, dust, and something she couldn't exactly name. Evelyn was sitting on the cold floor, her form hunched inward, shoulders shaking with sobs. Next to her lay a motionless figure. It's Charles," Evelyn said through broken breaths, her hands quivering. "Something happened to him." Mara's stare focused on the body. A handkerchief had been placed carefully over his face, hiding his features. A knot formed in her stomach. "What happened to him?" Mara asked, her voice faintly more than a hushed tone. "He must have come back while I was gone," Evelyn exclaimed abruptly, lifting her head. Her eyes were red and wild. "Are you sure you didn't see or hear him?" Mara faltered. The question unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Too much had happened in the first week. Strange noises, missing time, doors she insisted she hadn't touched. Her thoughts felt tangled and unreliable. Then Evelyn's expression stiffened. "Mara," she said slowly, "you locked him in the basement. You pushed that furniture against the door so he couldn't get out. We must get the constable." The words struck like a blow. Mara stumbled back a step, her breath faltering. Fear and rage welled up together. "No," she thought fiercely. "This is not my fault. Or was it?" Her mind reeled as every unsettling moment replayed itself. Had Charles returned without her knowing? Had she, in her confusion, trapped him down here? The possibility ripped at her sanity. But why wouldn't he call out? Why wouldn't he let her know he was there, especially knowing she was in the house? Mara, Evelyn said, rising unsteadily to her feet. You'd better go to your room and stay there. I will contact the constable. Mara shook her head desperately. Please, I must help. Evelyn's tone changed, sharp and cold. You have helped enough. Go now, please. The last word came out rough, almost cruel. Tears welled up and blurred Mara's vision as she backed away, the basement seeming to surround her. She turned and fled up the stairs, her legs weak beneath her. Once inside her room, she shut the door and leaned against it, silent tears sliding down her cheeks. Below her, the house creaked and groaned, heavy with accusation and doubt. For the rest of the evening, Mara remained shut away in her room and did not see Evelyn again. The house, which had earlier felt merely quiet, now seemed to stand still in suspense. Every floorboard creaked and groaned as the settling walls set her nerves on edge. Sleep refused to come. She paced the small room until her legs ached, stopping only to sit on the edge of the bed before rising again, her thoughts looping relentlessly through the events of the past few weeks. She had been so sure. She knew she had not seen Charles return, not to the house, not even to the grounds. She mulled over each day in her mind, each passing hour, searching for a moment she might have overlooked. Now doubt crept in like a slow poison. Had she been mistaken? Distracted? Or had something been deliberately hidden from her? Yet no matter how she examined it, one fact remained unforgivable. To lock a man in a basement for weeks, alive or dead, was an act beyond cruelty. The pressure of it weighed like a burden on her chest until tears finally came, hot and uncontrollable. Mara wept alone in the dark, mourning not just Charles, but the terrible uncertainty that now haunted her. Morning broke bright and cloudless, the sun streaming cheerfully through the window as though nothing in the world were amiss. The sound of carriage wheels crunching on the gravel snapped Mara to attention. Her heart jumped. She hurried to the window and peered down just as the carriage came to a stop. Two men climbed down. The constable, unmistakable in his uniform, and another man she assumed was his deputy. Evelyn was already outside, composed and neatly dressed, moving to meet them as if she had been expecting their arrival all along. Mara did not wait to see more. She slipped quietly into the corridor and moved to the staircase, positioning herself just out of sight. From there, she leaned cautiously over the banister as Evelyn ushered the men inside. Her voice drifted upward, steady and composed, as she related the events of the last month. Mara listened, stunned, as Evelyn told the constable how she had gone away to tend to her ailing mother, leaving her husband at home while her dear friend Mara visited. She related her return the previous day and her horror at discovering her husband deceased and locked away in the basement. Each word landed like a blow. Mara's breath froze in her throat. But that isn't what you told me, she thought wildly. Evelyn had said Charles had already left that very morning, gone on business, alive and well. After the constable finished his examination of the basement, the men brought the body up. Mara had moved to the front door by then, unable to stay hidden any longer. She stood just outside, wrapping her arms tightly around herself and watching in silence as they prepared to move Charles. The constable and his deputy emerged, carrying a stretcher between them. As they stepped through the doorway, A swift gust of wind blew in from outside, lifting the handkerchief covering the dead man's face. Mara gasped. That was not Charles on the stretcher. That was not the man she had seen on her first night in the house. It is not the man who had sat across from her at dinner, who had eaten quietly beside Evelyn, his presence unremarkable yet unmistakably real. This was a stranger, his features unfamiliar, his face wrong in a way that caused a chill straight through her bones. Evelyn reacted instantly, snatching up the fallen handkerchief and pressing it back over the man's face. Then she turned and glared at Mara, her eyes sharp and warning. For a long moment, the two women stared at each other. Mara searched Evelyn's face, seeing now something she had missed before, something chilling and calculating beneath the practiced calm. But she said nothing. Not yet. Mara was terrified. All intuition in her body screamed that she could no longer remain in Evelyn's house. Not for another minute. She ran to her room and grabbed the bags she had packed the night before. Her hands shook as she carried her few belongings toward the front door. The house appeared changed now. Heavier, watchful, as though it knew what had been done within its boundaries. The constable stood near the door, his hat clutched beneath his arm, and spoke to Mara in a low, measured tone, while Evelyn hovered just behind him. Evelyn's presence pressed against Mara's aura like a cold draft, silent, sharp, and impossible to ignore. He asked Mara to recount her visit, and she did so carefully, keeping her speech steady. She explained that Charles had left the house before Evelyn departed for her mother's home. She hadn't seen him since the evening they'd all shared supper together, the night before he left. Every word came across fragile, as though it could break if spoken too loudly. Suddenly, Evelyn cut in, her voice shrill and accusatory. "She was here alone with him," Evelyn snapped. "She locked him in the basement for weeks. He died down there. It's her fault." Mara whirled around to face her. "But that is not Charles," she cried, the words bursting out before she could stop them. A strange sound escaped Evelyn, a short, nervous snicker, half disbelief, half desperation. She turned back to the constable, her eyes wide with surprise. "Constable, you know Charles? You've known him for years. Is that him?" The constable paused. He rubbed his chin slowly, studying her as though pondering something heavy and unpleasant. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said at last. "That is Charles. I know him well." Mara's world seemed to tilt. Her mouth fell open as she stared at Evelyn, who now stood tall and composed, her head held high. A smug smile curved her lips, subtle though unmistakable. "Miss Ellison," the constable said kindly but firmly, "we must take you in while we conduct a full investigation. At present, you are our prime suspect." Mara's legs gave out beneath her. She crumpled to the floor, sobs tearing from her as her belongings scattered around her. The room blurred through her tears. Evelyn moved nearer and bent down, her breath warm against Mara's ear. "Thank you, Mara," she whispered smoothly. "You helped me very well." The constable and his deputy lifted Mara to her feet and guided her in the direction of the waiting wagon. She barely felt the ground under her feet. As the wagon doors closed and the wheels began to turn, Mara looked back one last time. Evelyn lingered on the front stoop, perfectly still, smiling as the wagon carried Mara away. For 5 days, Mara sat in the cold, damp prison cell waiting for the magistrate to return. The stone walls oozed constantly, moisture soaking through her clothes and bones. The straw mattress stank of rot, and rats skittered in the shadows at night, bold enough to brush against her skirts. She tried more than once to explain the last month to the constable. The dinner she had with Evelyn and the man she thought was Charles. The unfamiliar man. The locked basement. But he waved her off each time. "Tell it to the magistrate," he had said flatly, as though her words were already worthless. When the magistrate finally returned from attending another hearing in a town several miles away, Mara's hope flared briefly, then died just as quickly. He barely looked at her and read aloud from Evelyn's neatly prepared statement, his voice dry and uninterested, then snapped his book shut. Without asking a single clarifying question, he set a trial date for the following week. Mara's stomach sank at the magistrate's judgment. She had no money to hire a solicitor, no friend or relative who could vouch for her character, no one at all. She stayed isolated in her cell that night, realizing with gut-wrenching clarity that the world had already decided who she was. Mara's trial began early on a gray morning, the courtroom cold and echoing. The only witness called was Evelyn. Dressed in mourning black, she wept delicately as she told her story. How she had left Mara and Charles alone at the house. How she returned to find the basement door blocked and her husband dead. She spoke softly, carefully, as if every word had been rehearsed. Throughout her testimony, Evelyn's eyes never left Mara. She smirked, just barely, a trace of victory that others appeared oblivious to. When it was Mara's turn to give testimony, the magistrate questioned her curtly about her time alone in Evelyn's house. Her voice faltered slightly at first, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "The man on the stretcher," Mara uttered, gripping the rail of the witness box for balance, "was not the same man I was introduced to as Charles Harrowsby." Evelyn sprang to her feet at once. "That is untrue," she cried. "I introduced them at supper. We all ate together. Everyone knows this." The magistrate raised 2 fingers at Evelyn, motioning her to sit, then turned and scoffed at Mara, shaking his head. "And whom should I believe?" he said sharply. "You, unknown, with no standing, or Mrs. Harrowsby, a fine and upstanding member of this community?" Mara tried to plead her case, her speech stammering as she leaned on a witness box, but her words fell into emptiness. No one listened. The verdict was reached swiftly. Guilty. She was sentenced to 2 years in the women's workhouse for involuntary manslaughter. As soon as the verdict was handed down, 2 strong guards came and grabbed her arms and hauled her off unmercifully. They dragged her past Evelyn, who stood, her head aloof, fanning herself briskly. The workhouse was worse than Mara had imagined. She shared a small cell with 10 women, which was always cold and always wet. She slept sitting up more often than not, her joints aching, her back stiff with pain. The food was barely fit for animals: thin gruel, stale bread, and water that carried a rusty flavor. She learned quickly to keep her head down, to speak little, and to endure. Time moved slowly. What kept her sane was the idea of leaving. She dreamed of moving far away, of starting over somewhere no one knew her name or her shame. She had already lost her home, her reputation, and her freedom. The thought of escape, of rebuilding, was all she had left. Then, one day, she was told she had a visitor. Evelyn entered the visiting hall as if she were floating, chin held high, gloved hands folded gracefully in front of her. Mara had no desire to speak with her, yet she burned with questions she could no longer silence. Evelyn smirked coyly while approaching the table. "Hello, dear Mara. You look well, for your circumstances." "Why are you here?" Mara asked, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "What do you want, Evelyn?" "Why don't you sit, my dear?" Evelyn said lightly. "I only wanted to see how you are doing." Reluctantly, Mara took a seat, never taking her eyes off her. Evelyn leaned closely and lowered her voice. "Mara, I knew I could depend on you to help me in my time of need. You were always so trusting. And you were the perfect help since you had never met Charles before." Mara inhaled sharply. "You were right. That man at dinner was not Charles," Evelyn continued softly. "He was my friend, James. James Weldon. You don't know what I went through with Charles. He was a tight man with money, and he was about to put me out of the house and report me to the constable. I would have been left destitute. I spent 3 years with him, enduring his meanness and his foul temper. I could not allow him to ruin me." She leaned back, sighing as though relieved. "I had to act fast." Then she smiled again, aloof, satisfied. "Never mind, Mara. You have what? Another year before you're free? I'm sure it isn't so bad. You can endure it. It's not as though your life was ever much better than this." Something inside Mara snapped. She uncrossed her arms and clenched her fist, rising halfway from her seat before remembering where she was. For a brief moment, the room blurred, and Mara seethed with rage and humiliation. Just then, the visiting hour bell rang. She looked around the room, then glared at Evelyn across the table. Mara sighed and followed the protocol given by the matrons when the bell rang. She stood there, said nothing more, and waited for Evelyn to leave. Evelyn rose smoothly, waved a cheerful goodbye, and walked away without looking back. Mara remained frozen, watching her until the matron touched her shoulder and guided her from the room. She was shaking, sick with fury and despair. What proof did she have? Nothing but her word, and her word had already been dismissed. For the next year, Mara served her sentence in silence. She followed every rule, worked when assigned, and spoke only when necessary. When she was released 3 months early for good behavior, she walked out thinner, harder, and far less trusting than the woman who had once accepted an invitation to visit a friend. Now she realized she had never really known Evelyn, and she was no friend. A year and 9 months into her sentence, Mara found herself standing outside the grim stone walls of the workhouse, her thin shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. The heavy door had shut firmly behind her with a resounding thump, and for a long moment she stood there, uncertain and afraid. She had no family waiting for her, no coins in her pocket, and no idea where her next meal might come from. With nowhere else to turn, she set her feet toward the distant town, hoping that somehow opportunity, or at least kindness, might find her along the road. The walk was longer than she had expected. Each step grew heavier as the day went by, and by the time dusk crept across the sky, her legs ached and her stomach burned with hunger. She had not yet reached the town when twilight gave way to darkness fully surrounding her. Cold settled through her old shoes, and exhaustion threatened to pull her to the ground. Just as hopelessness started to surround her, she spotted a large house rising in the distance, its windows glowing warmly against the night. Summoning what little courage she had left, Mara made her way to the house cautiously. The iron gate squeaked as she eased it open, and her heart beat rapidly as she mounted the steps to the front door. She rang the bell and waited, hands quivering, rehearsing her plea in her mind. The door opened to reveal a plump woman dressed in a neat maid's uniform. Her countenance was guarded, her eyes surveying Mara from head to toe. "I am sorry to bother you," Mara uttered softly. "I was inquiring whether you would have anything left over I could eat, and perhaps if I could sleep in the barn. I would be glad to do any work you need." The maid examined her suspiciously from head to toe. She then stepped out on the porch and inspected the surroundings. "Are you alone?" she asked. "Yes, I am." Mara shook her head vigorously up and down. The maid stepped back in the doorway and surveyed Mara once again. After a brief moment, she told Mara to wait while she fetched the mistress of the house. Mara shook her head yes eagerly again and waited. Minutes later, a gentle-faced woman appeared at the doorway, her manner calm and inviting. Mara repeated her request nervously, offering her labor in exchange for food and shelter. "Have you come from the workhouse?" the woman inquired softly. Mara lowered her head, shame flooding her cheeks. "Yes, ma'am." The woman sighed, with gentle understanding, then nodded. "Go around to the back. The cook will see to it that you have something to eat." Mara's gratefulness was overwhelming. She thanked the woman again and again before walking towards the side of the house, then disappearing around the back. The meal that followed seemed like a dream: roast beef, tender vegetables, and warm potatoes. She ate quickly, almost desperately, as though afraid it might all disappear before she could get to it. It was the first proper meal she had eaten in 2 long years. When she finished, the woman returned and stated her name as Mrs. Elizabeth Chamberlain. She explained that she lived there with her husband and their 4 children, whose ages ranged from 2 to 14. Mrs. Chamberlain asked about Mara's time in the workhouse, and though it was difficult, Mara told her story and how long she had endured it. Mrs. Chamberlain listened without interruption, her countenance filled with quiet sympathy. Soon after, she summoned the maid and instructed her to prepare a bath for Mara. The warm water felt like a blessing, washing away not only dirt, but months of hardship. Mrs. Chamberlain even offered one of her older dresses, clean and neatly mended, which brought tears to Mara's eyes. "Thank you so much, ma'am," Mara said. "Is there something I could do to repay your kindness?" "My dear," Mrs. Chamberlain answered gently, "there are times when we must help without asking for anything in return, trusting that kindness will one day find its way back to us. You can sleep in the room beside the cook tonight and help her with breakfast in the morning. There is much to be done." When Mr. Chamberlain returned home later that evening, she was introduced to him, and he welcomed her warmly, strengthening the sense that she had at last discovered a safe place. That night, Mara fell asleep, filled with a happiness she had almost forgotten was possible. Over the next 6 months, Mara remained with the Chamberlains, eventually becoming the children's tutor. For the first time in years, she felt appreciated and content, the painful memories of the past slowly fading. Life had taken a hopeful turn, and she had the courage to imagine a hopeful tomorrow. One afternoon, Mrs. Chamberlain instructed the cook to prepare tea and cake for a special visitor expected later that day. She asked Mara to mind the younger children while she entertained her guest. The woman explained that she and her husband had met this friend only a month earlier at a gathering in town and had recently invited her for tea. An apparently normal visit that would soon prove far more significant than Mara could have guessed. When the carriage pulled up at 4:30, its wheels rattling over the gravel drive, Mara was seated on the rug in the playroom, the late evening glow streaming through the tall windows. The children were gathered around her, their small voices swelling and falling as they took turns spelling words. She corrected them gently, tapping the table with her finger, her mind calm and pleasantly occupied. By 5 o'clock, the children were growing restless, and Mara decided it was time to speak with the cook about supper. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and left the playroom. Her footsteps soft upon the polished floor as she made her way toward the stairs. On reaching the top step, a voice drifted upward, low, confident, and clearly recognizable. Mara halted abruptly. Her fingers clenched the banister while she listened. That voice did not belong in this house. A biting cold crept along her back. Slowly, carefully, she began to descend the stairs, each footfall made with deliberate caution. When she reached the bottom, she edged toward the front room, stopping just short of the doorway. She leaned forward and peered through the narrow opening between the door jamb and the door. Her gasp caught in her throat. Evelyn stood poised in the room, elegant as ever, her posture composed, her movements controlled. Next to her was the man Mara recognized at once, the same man Evelyn had introduced on that first unsettling day at the house. James Weldon. Mara snapped her head back, pressing herself against the wall, and inhaled sharply through her nose. "What are they doing here?" she uttered under her breath. Compelled by dread along with curiosity, she peered through the opening again. Mrs. Chamberlain sat, slumped in a large upholstered chair, her head tilted to one side, her hands limp in her lap. She looked as though she were asleep, too deeply asleep. Evelyn stood above her, poking lightly at her arm and fanning her face with quick, impatient movements. "She is not waking up," Evelyn said in a sharp whisper. "You gave her too much." Her eyes flashed as she turned to James. "I told you, just a little. We must keep her as a friend until I can find a way to get to her husband." James leaned closer to Mrs. Chamberlain, studying her with disquieting calm. "She will come around soon," he replied evenly. "Give her a little more time." Then he straightened and looked at Evelyn. "Did you find what you came for?" Evelyn reached into her sleeve and produced several papers. She waved them briefly, a satisfied smile appearing on her lips, before folding them neatly and tucking them into her pocket. Mara's heart beat wildly, and so loudly she was sure it could be heard. Her thoughts raced. She should run. She should scream. She should do something, but her legs felt fixed to the floor. The last thing she wanted was to confront Evelyn. Not like this. Not when she didn't understand what she was witnessing. Suddenly, Mrs. Chamberlain groaned. Mara stiffened as the woman's eyelids fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Oh, Elizabeth, my dear," Evelyn crooned, instantly transforming her voice into one of gentle concern. You passed out on us. Maybe you should lie down for a while until you feel better. We must have tire you out." Mrs. Chamberlain murmured something incoherent, her words slurred, her confusion plain. She lifted one trembling hand and rang the bell on a small table next to her chair. Mara did not wait. She tiptoed away from the doorway and slipped into a narrow alcove at the end of the hall, pressing herself into the shadows just as a maid hurried past and entered the front room. Her heartbeat rumbled like thunder in her ears. While the maid attended to Mrs. Chamberlain, Mara silently climbed the stairs, careful not to let a single board creak beneath her weight. She retreated to her room and went straight to the window, her fingers clutching the curtain. From there, she watched as Evelyn and James emerged from the house moments later, perfectly composed. They climbed into their carriage as though nothing were amiss, and soon the horses were trotting down the drive, carrying them out of sight. Mara remained at the window long after they were gone, her chest tight with fear. This couldn't be happening again. What was Evelyn doing to Mrs. Chamberlain, and why? And worse still, how far would she go to get what she wanted? Mara was certain of one thing. Whatever Evelyn was planning, it was nowhere near finished. For the next week, Mara did not see Mrs. Chamberlain at all. Each day she hoped for a chance to speak with her, to gently bring up Evelyn's name and the anxiety that now clung to it. But the opportunity never came. And even if it had, Mara was not certain how she would begin. It was not her place to question Mrs. Chamberlain's friendships, much less warn her against them. Still, the sense that something was wrong refused to leave her. Mrs. Chamberlain had taken ill and remained confined to her bed, her once vivacious voice reduced to a tired whisper. The doctor came daily, his expression grave, and instructed her to rest completely and not be disturbed for any reason. Visitors were turned away, and messages went unanswered. So, Mara waited, uneasy and helpless. A few days later, Mara was asked to go into town to collect a dress Mrs. Chamberlain had ordered weeks earlier. The timing felt like a small mercy. The children were away on a playdate with their older cousins, and the house was unusually quiet. Grateful for the errand and the chance to be out, Mara set off down the familiar road toward town. Her first stop was the dress shop. The fragrance of pressed fabric and lavender sachets permeated the room as Mrs. Henry, the storekeeper, disappeared into the back to retrieve the dress. While she waited, Mara wandered between the racks, running her fingers lightly over silk and wool, admiring dresses far finer than any she would ever wear. The doorbell above the door tinkled sharply. "Hello, Mrs. Henry. I want some help finding a dress for a party this weekend," a cheerful voice called out. Mara looked up and froze. It was Evelyn. Her heart leapt into her throat. Acting on instinct, Mara slipped behind a row of mannequins and pulled them slightly closer together, creating a narrow shield. From her hiding place, she peered through the gaps, hardly daring to breathe as she watched Evelyn glide toward the counter. "Ah, Mrs. Weldon," Mrs. Henry said prudently, her hands folded atop the counter. "I am happy to help you, but you have a large credit here that is due immediately. I cannot extend any further credit until it is paid." Evelyn stopped short, her pleasant expression cracking. "Must you embarrass me so?" she snapped. "I will pay the bill. There is money coming to me next week. Now," she waved a dismissive hand, Help me find a dress." She turned away from the counter, head held high, and began flipping through the racks as though the matter were settled. "No, madam," Mrs. Henry replied, her tone resolute. "I will not. Your bill must be paid first." Evelyn hissed under her breath, her shoulders stiffening. "You will regret this injustice," she said coldly. Then she spun on her heel, jerked open the door, and swept out of the shop, the bell clanging angrily behind her. Mara waited a few minutes, then cautiously stepped from her hiding place. Mrs. Henry met her eyes and shook her head, a wordless assent of trouble, before returning to packing the dress Mara was picking up, as though nothing unusual had happened. Mara said nothing. She watched through the window as Evelyn strode down the street, her back straight, her pace confident. After signing for the parcel, Mara made a quick decision. Keeping a careful distance, she followed. Evelyn moved through the business district, greeting shopkeepers and passers-by with easy waves and practiced smiles. Then she turned onto a quieter road lined with impressive houses, tall gates, manicured hedges, and wide porches shaded by flowering trees. Even here, Evelyn nodded to neighbors as though she belonged among them. At the far end of the street, a man stepped out from behind a wrought iron fence. Mara recognized him at once. James Weldon. Without hesitation, Evelyn fell into step beside him. Together, they turned away from the grand homes and continued on, the scenery changing at each stride. The houses grew smaller, the paint more worn. The road narrowed, showing untended yards. Mara slowed and stopped beneath a large oak tree, watching as the pair surveyed the surroundings cautiously before approaching a dilapidated house with sagging steps and an unkempt yard. They disappeared inside. Mara remained where she was, her pulse quickening. She thought. Very interesting. After several minutes, she turned back toward town. She had stayed long enough, and should already have been home, but the events of the day remained in her mind as she made her way home. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Chamberlain appeared fully restored. The pallor that formerly haunted her face was gone, supplanted by the gentle color and composed manner that marked her usual self. She laughed with the children again, walked through the house with steady purpose, and spoke as though nothing unsettling had ever occurred. To anyone else, the troubling incident during Evelyn Weldon's last visit might have seemed little more than a strange lapse. To Mara, it persisted like a shadow she could not outrun. But seeing Mrs. Chamberlain well again, she had nearly convinced herself to let it go. That afternoon, Mara took the children for their customary walk along the narrow path that weaved through the woods behind the house. The breeze was cool, filled with the smell of moist leaves and pine, and the children chattered as they walked, blissfully unaware of the unease swirling in Mara's mind. As they headed back home and rounded the bend that opened onto the drive, Mara's heart stopped. A carriage rolled toward the house, its wheels grinding over the gravel. It was the same dark carriage, unchanged in every detail, that previously carried Evelyn and James Weldon during their last visit. Alarm grew in her chest, swift and suffocating. Evelyn was back. Mara hurried the children forward, her voice faltering as she directed them toward the house. She saw the Weldons alight from the carriage, James assisting Evelyn, who was stepping lightly, her countenance serene, almost pleased. Too pleased. Inside, Mara sent the children upstairs at once. Go straight to the playroom, she told them, firm but gentle. Do not come down unless I say so. They obeyed, noticing a trace of urgency in the sound of her voice that discouraged questions. She quickly moved to the kitchen where the cook was bent over the stove, the warm smell of supper filling the room. Is Mr. Chamberlain still at home? Mara asked, forcing calm into her strained voice. Yes, he's in the study, the cook replied absently. Then she added, The Weldons have come for dinner. They might be staying the night. The words shocked Mara like a blow. The blood drained from her face, leaving her dizzy. What is wrong with you? The cook asked sharply, turning to look at her. You're white as a sheet. Mara opened her mouth, yet no words emerged. She shook her head, backed away, and quietly moved into the hallway, her heart beating fast. She moved quickly but quietly toward the front room. Through the doorway, she saw Mrs. Chamberlain seated comfortably with Evelyn and James, teacups in hand, smiling as though nothing were amiss. Mara had to act. Now. But what could she possibly say to Mr. Chamberlain to get him to go to the front room? She turned and hurried down the corridor to the study, knocking softly at the door. Come in, Mr. Chamberlain's voice called. She entered and closed the door behind her with care. He looked up from his desk, immediately alert to the distress on her face. Mara, what is wrong? Are the children all right? Yes, sir, she replied, lowering her voice. They are safe, but it is Mrs. Chamberlain. I fear she has fallen ill again. She has company, and I believe she needs you at once. Please, sir. He rose without hesitation, concern etched into his features. Of course. Will you come and help? I must attend to the children, Mara answered quickly. He nodded and hurried from the room. Mara followed him as far as the front room door, then stepped back into a small alcove, pressing herself into the shadows. From there, she listened as he anxiously questioned his wife. James Weldon was now alone with Mrs. Chamberlain. However, Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Mara leaned forward just in time to see Evelyn glide around the corner at the far end of the passageway and enter the study, her movements careful and deliberate. She stretched out to grasp the door, easing it open as though she feared being heard. Mara's heartbeat hammered. What was she searching for? Before she could move, a small voice sounded behind her. One of the younger children had come downstairs, searching for her. Mara knelt down quickly, placing a finger to her lips. We are playing a game, she whispered. I need you to go into the study and look around. Quietly. The child hesitated. She knew she was forbidden to enter her father's study, but curiosity won. She skipped toward the door, gently opened it, and entered the room. What am I looking for? She called brightly. Evelyn turned, startled, her composure slipping for just a moment. Hello, young one, she said smoothly. And whom might you be? I am Beatrice Chamberlain, the child replied proudly. Are you looking for my father? He is in the front room. Come, I will take you to him. Evelyn smiled, her expression softening as she took the girl's hand. Well, thank you, dear. You are very kind. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the front room. Mara retreated into the alcove once more, scarcely daring to breathe. Moments later, she heard Mr. Chamberlain's voice, courteous yet resolute, apologizing and explaining that Mrs. Chamberlain was not well enough to entertain. The Weldons offered their regrets and took their leave. When the carriage finally disappeared down the drive, Mara remained still, her legs trembling uncontrollably. She knew now, with unnerving assurance, that this was not the end. She would have to speak to the Chamberlains. And soon. While Mr. Chamberlain and the maid helped Mrs. Chamberlain settle into bed, making sure she was comfortable and resting, Mara waited in the corridor. Her heartbeat raced as she mustered her courage. This might be her only chance. When Mr. Chamberlain stepped away from his wife's bedside, Mara quietly approached him. "Mr. Chamberlain," she uttered softly but firmly, "may I have a word with you? It is urgent, and it concerns your wife's health." He studied her face for a moment, perhaps mulling over her words, then nodded. "Very well, come with me." They moved to a small sitting room nearby, closing the door behind them. Mara took a steadying breath and commenced. She told him everything: her sudden arrest, the grim days spent in the workhouse, and the humiliation and suffering she had endured. She explained how it had all come about and why she thought she had been targeted. "I know," Mara murmured, her voice trembling but still unwavering, "that Evelyn did something to her husband. I cannot prove it, but I am certain of it. And now I fear she is doing something similar to your wife. I was surprised to see her here the last time, and then she came back. I followed them the other day and found where they are staying in the area." Mr. Chamberlain did not interrupt and paid close attention, his expression darkening with every single word. When Mara finished, a heavy silence filled the room. At last, he spoke. "What is the name of the constable who arrested you, Mara, and where did you follow the Weldons?" he asked. She gave him the constable's name and told him where he could be found. Then she gave directions on where Evelyn and James went when she followed them. Mr. Chamberlain gave a slow nod, committing the information to memory. "Thank you for confiding in me with this," he said. "You need not worry. I will see that this matter is investigated and dealt with properly." Mara inclined her head, a trace of relief washing over her as she realized she had finally been heard. 5 days later, Mr. Chamberlain finally rode up to the house after a week spent in a state of strained anticipation, where every sound on the road set her nerves jangling. He was not alone. Another man sat stiffly beside him, his posture upright, his expression grave in the way of someone accustomed to bearing unpleasant truths. When they dismounted, Mr. Chamberlain made the introductions at once. The stranger was John Williams, the newly appointed constable of Brampton, the very town where Evelyn lived at the time of Mara's arrest. Brampton, it seemed, had gone nearly a year without a proper constable, and during that absence more than a few matters had been quietly buried or ignored. Keen to prove his worth in the position, Constable Williams had begun reopening old cases. Mara's arrest was one of the first to draw his attention. In retracing the events surrounding it, he had uncovered information that troubled him deeply. Before Constable Williams could continue, Mr. Chamberlain interjected, his jaw tense. They had located the house where Mara had followed Evelyn and James. James Weldon had been found there and taken into custody without resistance. Evelyn, however, had not been home. She had disappeared. The words settled heavily in the room. Mara released a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Now Evelyn was aware, without question, that Mara was nearby, and that knowledge made her dangerous. Mara's thoughts raced as she wondered what Evelyn might do next, armed with that certainty. Constable Williams then laid out the rest of his findings. Evelyn, he explained, had never been married to Charles Harrowsby at all. She had merely claimed the title of wife and moved into his household as if it were the truth. This deception was not new. Records and testimonies showed she had done the same thing to two other men before setting her sights on Charles. Evelyn and James worked as partners, meticulously choosing wealthy men and convincing them, through lies, charm, and manipulation, that she was their lawful wife. When the chosen man already had a wife, the scheme became more sinister. The wives were slowly poisoned with a concoction Evelyn and James prepared themselves, administered in small enough doses to avoid suspicion until it was too late. Once the wife was gone, Evelyn seamlessly assumed her place. The men, meanwhile, were given another potion, one that clouded their minds and cemented the belief that Evelyn truly was their spouse. Together, Evelyn and James would drain the men of their wealth. When the money ran dry, the men were disposed of, and the pair moved on to their next target. According to Constable Williams, the latest plan appeared to involve Mrs. Chamberlain as a means of reaching Mr. Chamberlain himself. Charles Harrowsby's family, Constable Williams continued, had intervened just in time. After Charles's death, his relatives arrived quickly enough to prevent Evelyn and James from dismantling the entire estate. The pair had managed to steal a modest sum by forging Charles's signature on several documents, but their success was short-lived. The moment Charles's older brother arrived, they were forced to flee. During the 3 years Evelyn and Charles lived together, the family believed they were married, yet no marriage record could be found. No license, no certificate, nothing at all. James Weldon, now in custody, had confessed to everything. He had spoken freely, perhaps hoping it would lessen his punishment. Still, despite all he had revealed, one crucial piece remained missing: Evelyn herself. No one knew where she had gone. The house was being watched day and night in the hope she might return, but so far there had been no sign of her. Constable Williams fixed his gaze on Mara, then spoke, his voice subdued though strong. "Mara, I am certain she knows you are here," he said. "You were too close to the truth before, and she will not forget that. Be on guard. Be careful." 2 days later, Mara accompanied the cook to the town market. The central square was unusually busy so early in the afternoon. Market stalls arranged along the stone pavement in uneven rows, their awnings snapping quietly in the breeze. Merchants called out prices for apples, bread, and bolts of cloth, while townsfolk loitered in small clusters, exchanging gossip beneath the steady toll of the church bell. Mara kept her head down as she crossed the square, a basket hooked over her arm more for disguise than necessity. Constable Williams' warning played over in her head, encouraging care with every step. She felt it before she saw it, that unmistakable sensation prickling at the back of her neck, the notion of being watched. "Mara!" The sound of her name, spoken lightly and with deliberate calm, froze her in place. She turned slowly. Evelyn stood near the old stone fountain at the center of the square, as though she had every right to be there. She looked unchanged, impossibly composed, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, her dress plain but flattering in a way that suggested careful calculation rather than simplicity. If anything, she appeared healthier than before, her lips full of color, her eyes vivid and alert. Only those eyes betrayed her, keen and perceptive, fixed on Mara with open curiosity. So, Evelyn said, smiling subtly, it's true. You really are still breathing. Mara clenched the basket handle. You shouldn't be here. Evelyn laughed softly, the sound nearly melodic. Oh, but I should. This is a public square. Surely you don't mean to accuse me of anything. Not here. Her gaze flicked pointedly at the people passing by, utterly unmindful of the danger standing among them. Mara looked around, measuring distances, noting who might overhear. James is in custody, she said quietly. It's over, Evelyn. The smile weakened, just for a moment, though Evelyn recovered quickly. James was always careless, she replied. I warned him that loyalty without intelligence is a liability. Mara sensed a chill settle deep in her bones. The law knows what you've done over the years. It concerns the unspoken grievances you imposed on Charles and the others, as well as the attempts you made to harm Mrs. Chamberlain. It is all over. The lies you told and the poison you both concocted. All of it. You will be caught and sent to the same workhouse you put me in. Evelyn moved nearer, lowering her voice. And yet, here I stand, free as ever. Funny how that works. She tilted her head, studying Mara as though she were a riddle. You were always obtuse. You never look past what is before you. Then you ask the wrong questions. Obtuse? Someone died, Evelyn. I am glad you opened my eyes to your schemes. I will not be so open again, especially since your actions sent me to the workhouse. Mara shot back. And why me, Evelyn? What did I ever do to you for you to betray me like this? Yes, Evelyn agreed coolly. And people always die. The difference is whether their deaths are useful. Mara, people use what is available to gain the best advantage. Plus, you are so trusting it is unbelievable. Mara's heart beat wildly, but she forced herself not to retreat. You won't get away this time. Evelyn's stare grew cold. I already have. The only reason I'm here is courtesy. She leaned in just enough for Mara to smell lavender on her breath. Consider this a kindness. Forget Brampton and leave this town. Leave now, and forget you ever knew my name. And if I don't? Mara murmured. Evelyn straightened, her smile reappearing, thin, dangerous. Then I'll do what I always do. I'll survive, and you'll regret standing in my way. For a long moment, neither woman moved. Then a shout rang out from the far side of the square, someone calling for the constable. Evelyn's eyes shifted toward the sound, annoyance flashing across her face. Another time, then, she said smoothly. Do be careful, Mara. Vigilance, wasn't it? With that, Evelyn melted into the crowd, her bonnet disappearing among the colors and movement of the market. By the time Mara pushed forward, heart beating fast, there was no sign of her, only the hummed sound of ordinary life carrying on as if nothing remarkable had just occurred. Mara stood firm alone in the square, the burden of the encounter bearing down upon her. Evelyn was still out there, watching, planning. And now the search had truly begun. 3 days later, Evelyn was caught. It happened just beyond the town limits, where the road thinned into a gray scar of dirt and stone, and the trees pressed in close, their twisted limbs knitting together overhead. The light there was dim even at midday, as if the sun itself refused to look in that direction. The air lay heavy and unmoving, and every sound seemed to vanish unwillingly. Constable Williams and his deputies rode that road often with relentless drive. On that particular day, they were on their way to investigate the disappearance of Mr. Henley an old man who had not been seen in days. His caretaker returned at first light from visiting relatives, frantic and breathless, and found the house vacant. He rode to the constable station to report the missing man. Mr. Henley had not left willingly, he insisted. The elderly man had met a woman about 2 weeks before he went to visit his relatives, and she had spent every day with him. The caretaker was reluctant to leave Mr. Henley, but the woman who called herself Rose insisted she would stay and take care of him. Mr. Henley had agreed because he had grown fond of Rose. The group of lawmen had nearly reached the bend in the road when they saw her. Evelyn walked ahead of them, alone, her dark dress brushing the dust. She walked with an unnatural calm, as though she had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. When she looked back and noticed the riders, her step lagged for the briefest moment. Then she ran. She veered off the road and plunged into a thick stand of trees, vanishing into their crooked shadows. Branches clawed at her hair and dress as she fled, roots rising like snares under her feet. She had been imprudent, too sure of her own cleverness, too accustomed to slipping away unseen. She believed, as she always had, that the woods would hide her, but the caretaker had seen her. He cried out, voice sharp with terror and recognition. "There!" he shouted, pointing wildly. "That's her. That's the woman I left with Mr. Henley." Like a trumpet, the words echoed through the trees. Constable Williams dismounted at once. The deputies followed, spreading out as they entered the grove, their boots cracking branches and crushing leaves that stank of rot. Evelyn ran until her lungs ached and her heartbeat pounded in her ears. But the forest narrowed around her, ushering her forward, hemming her in. She burst into a clearing and skidded to a halt. The old mill towered before her. Blackened beams, collapsed walls, and the long-rotted and still wheel. The place had a strong, rotting, damp wood odor. It was a grave of a building, offering no passage through. She turned slowly as the men emerged from the trees, one by one, their faces hard and ashen in the murk. There was no path left to take, no shadow deep enough to disappear into. When Constable Williams reached her, her composure finally fractured. The calm mask she wore slipped, revealing a void beneath fear, yes, but also resignation. As he took her arm, the woods became hushed, as though satisfied, and whatever chance she had ever had to escape was swallowed up with the light. "Where is Mr. Henley?" the caretaker yelled, his voice slicing sharply through the trees. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment before answering, a weary sigh slipping past her lips. "What do you mean? Where is he?" she said, forcing calm into her voice. "I left him at his house yesterday evening. I expect he is still there, exactly where I left him." "Well, he is not," the caretaker snapped. He took a step toward her, his boots grinding against the forest floor. "So tell me, what did you do to him?" His sudden movement made Evelyn stiffen, but she did not retreat. Before she could respond, a hand rose between them. Constable Williams stood firm, his countenance hard as stone. "That will be enough," he said sharply. "We will not question her here." He turned to the others. "Deputy Neal, take her back to the constabulary. The rest of us will go to Mr. Henley's house and search for him." For a moment, the caretaker looked as though he might argue. His expression stiffened, and his fists were tight at his sides. Then, slowly, he stepped back, swallowing whatever protest seethed behind his eyes. Without another word, the group closed in around Evelyn and guided her away, the path through the woods narrowing around them as they walked towards the waiting horses. Mara was on her way to speak with the constable when she happened upon the scene and had arrived as they were binding Evelyn's wrists. For the first time since the market square, Evelyn looked afraid. Her bonnet lay crushed in the dirt, her hair falling loose around her face. The sharp, cunning eyes Mara remembered darted wildly from one man to the next, until they landed on Mara. Then something changed. The fear sharpened, focused. "Mara," Evelyn said breathlessly, "you have to help me." Constable Williams frowned. "You know this woman?" "Unfortunately," Mara replied, her voice composed despite the tremor in her chest. "That's Evelyn Harrowsby or Weldon. I don't know what name she's going by these days." Evelyn stepped forward as far as the ropes would allow. "They don't understand," she said quickly. "James twisted everything. You know I had no intention for things to go this far." Mara laughed, a short, bitter sound that amazed even herself. "You poisoned women. You stole lives and names. You had me arrested to save yourself. And now James will take all the blame for your misdeeds." Evelyn's eyes welled up with tears, real or carefully summoned. Mara could no longer tell. "I did what I had to do. You don't know what it's like to survive the way I have. I grew up with nothing and had to fend for myself at an early age. I found the best way that worked for me." "I know exactly what it's like," Mara responded, stepping closer. "I also grew up with nothing, but I never thought to take from anyone to elevate myself, and I survived the cell you put me in, Evelyn. The looks and whispers from the community, and the fear that I might never be believed." At Mara's words, Evelyn's voice lowered to a hushed tone. "If you speak for me, they'll listen. You're respected now. You could say you were mistaken. You could say I was misled. Please." Constable Williams shifted uneasily. "Mara, you don't have to—" "Yes," Mara interrupted, never taking her eyes off Evelyn. "I do." She crouched so both women were eye to eye. "You want my help? Then you begin by telling the truth." Evelyn swallowed. "Out loud!" Mara insisted. "Here, in front of them." The silence stretched. Finally, Evelyn's shoulders sagged. "I lied," she said hoarsely. "About Charles, about the others, about you." Her voice faltered with emotion. "I framed Mara. I had her arrested, knowing she was innocent because I needed someone to blame for Charles's death. Someone who had no ties to the area." Mara rose. "That's not enough." Evelyn looked up, desperation marked on every line of her face. "What more do you want from me?" "I want an apology," Mara declared plainly. "Not a performance, not a plea, a real apology for what you did to me." Tears spilled freely now. "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered. "I'm sorry I ruined your name. I'm sorry I stole your freedom. I was cruel and I knew exactly what I was doing." Mara nodded once. "And now restitution." Evelyn blinked. "What?" "You took from me," Mara continued. "My work, my reputation, my peace. Any money recovered from your schemes goes toward clearing my name publicly and compensating me for what I lost. Every record must be corrected. Every accusation must be withdrawn." Constable Williams looked thoughtful, then slowly nodded. "That can be arranged." Evelyn collapsed to her knees. "I'll do it, I swear. Just don't let them hang me." Mara's expression softened, but only slightly. "I'm not saving you from justice, Evelyn. I'm saving myself from your lies." She turned away as the deputies lifted Evelyn to her feet. As they escorted her down the road, Evelyn called out one last time, "Mara, I truly am sorry." Mara didn't respond. For the first time since her arrest, the weight on her chest eased. Evelyn was no longer a hidden threat at the edge of her life. She was exposed, named, and bound by the truth. And Mara, at last, was free. Thank you for listening to this intriguing audio story presented by Square Angles. Please subscribe, share, like, and comment for more suspense-filled drama. Hear you next time.